Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, Allie's Book Nook. Today I'm going to discuss with you the 5 books that I have read since we met last in December of 2024 and then a couple books into 2025. So before we get into them, the books are Stephen King, Gerald's Game, Sally Hepworth, The Younger Wife, John Boyne, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, Joe Millen Jr., The All-American, a novel, and then Kristen Hanna, The Great Alone. Okay, so the first book that I read since we chatted last was Gerald's Game by Stephen King. And let me find, I'm going to compare in my book journal here. And this will help me remember because this was a while ago that I read this one. I feel like this one took me a little while to get through. Yeah, so this was either the 56th or 57th book of the year, depending on Goodreads or Fable. For me, I ended the year with, I'm going to say 58 books, just to be conservative, but possibly 59. Anyway, this was a psychological horror / suspense book. I primarily read it in paper copy, also ebook through Libby, and then a little bit of audio through Libby, but there were no chapter breaks, so I didn't really like that. And I read this from December 7th to December 22nd, and it's 387 pages. So not too bad for a Stephen King book. So my first thoughts were that I've been wanting to read this for several years. It's a companion novel, considered a companion novel, to Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King, which is it's my favorite book of his. So when I started reading this, I recognized that I kind of forgot about his quirky writing style and choice of wording. And that's pretty unique to Stephen King, his style of writing. And so I was quickly reminded of that. In this book, the plot unfolds really quickly, the first 1 to 2 chapters. My final impressions were that it was good. It was a little drawn out in parts. I liked the horror aspect of it. I liked the graphic descriptions. It actually had me cringing out loud at moments. And so there also was an expected plot twist at the end. So out of 5 stars, I gave characters 3 out of 5, plot 4, writing 4.5, and overall 3.5. Would I recommend this? I said yes if you're a Stephen King fan. If not, you still might enjoy it. It is more manageable in size than some of his other books, and of course, no one can deliver details quite like Stephen King. So this book takes place in alternating timelines from what was the present day when it was written, which was early 1990s, and then the 1960s in Maine, where most of his books take place. So we start out in present day. This gal, Jessie, her husband is into some kind of weird stuff, as you can see on the cover here. They go to their secluded cabin in like the off season in fall, and they don't tell anyone. And they go there, and he handcuffs her to the bed, and then he dies. Something happens and he dies. And that's not really a spoiler alert. That's how this plot unfolds. So now she has to figure out how to survive and how to get out of there when nobody knows she's there, and she's got all these things working against her. This also has an alternating timeline of the 1960s when Jessie was a girl, when the eclipse happened in Maine, which is also where Dolores Claiborne is set during that same time of the eclipse. And there is a little bit of crossover. She has a couple kind of visions of Dolores Claiborne, and that made me want to go back and reread Dolores Claiborne because I want to see if there's any references to Gerald's Game in there. These books both were published the same year. And so, like I said, they're in the same universe. So there's a little bit of cross-reference going on there. So this is the first Stephen King book I've read in about 10 years or more. It was a little drawn out in parts. Could have used a little less detail of stuff that happened in the 60s. But let's see here. And I won't get into that. It did make me, like I say, want to read Dolores Claiborne again. The book had an unexpected twist at the end, and actually, I almost wish that that twist wouldn't have happened, that that character would have stayed how I thought they were. I'm okay with the plot twist. I can get behind it, but I kind of wanted it to be a little bit more the way we thought that part of the story was unfolding. And like I said, there was that part that just I made me like cringe out loud when I was reading this in a public waiting room. So gotta love that from Stephen King. So yeah, I would recommend it. It's a pretty, it's a little bit more psychological thriller than horror, compared to some of his other books. The next book I read is The Younger Wife by Sally Hepworth. This was my first Sally Hepworth book. And this one was a pretty quick read. Let me find it in here. It took me about a week to get through it. Yeah, so I would call this a suburban/domestic thriller. I read it paper and audio, and took me from December 23rd to December 30th, and it's 346 pages. So my first thoughts on this book was that it starts with a death at a wedding, and then you work your way back about a year. There's short chapters, and they're told from alternating perspectives of female main characters. Ratings on this out of 5 stars. Characters I gave a 3, plot 3.5, writing 3.5, and overall 3.5. Would I recommend this book? Maybe. It was a good book, but I struggled with something I'm going to tell you about in a second here. I would like to read more Sally Hepworth in the future. This was, like I said, my first book of hers. So, this book, I'm just going to say it. I try not to give spoilers, but at the end, and then looking back at how the story unfolds, it's actually very similar to a popular Australian book from about 10 years before this, Big Little Lies by Leanne Morley. I don't know how that really flew, but it was so similar in the plot. Okay, so you think it's gonna, like I said, a death happens at a wedding, and then you hear alternating female main character perspectives about a year before the occurrence leading up to it. And they're all strong female main characters. This isn't really a I'm going to steal your life kind of book like I thought it would be with The Younger Wife. They're all supportive female characters, and that actually, with that and them going back in time, alternating stories to tell it, reminded me of Big Little Lies, and the end of it. I don't really want to per se give this away, especially if you hadn't read Big Little Lies, but if you had and you got to the end of this, I don't see how you wouldn't see that this was so similar. And this was a big hit, and she's a popular Australian author, and this was, like I said, was written 10 years before this one. So I don't know what happened there. I didn't like it. I am going to give Sally Hepworth another chance. I want to read Darling Girls. I want to read a couple of her other books, but that just felt kind of like a copy and paste from another pre-established Australian novel. So, suburban thriller type novel. So if you have read these, let me know. Did you find a similarity between Big Little Lies and The Younger Wife? To me, it was blatantly obvious, but maybe that was just me. So that kind of put a damper in it, but if you can get past that, it was a decent book. And like I said, I do want to read more books of hers. My cat is getting into stuff here, so I'm sorry. The next book I read this in a day. It's the first book, the only book in 2024 that I got through in a day. Probably because it's a children's book, but it's The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And so my daughter, I wanted to read this book for years. I've had the copy for years. My daughter is reading it for school. She's in 8th grade, and so I wanted to read it together with her. So this is by John Boyne. It's a historical young adult fiction book. And by young adult, I would say more middle school age reading level. Took me a day to read it, 216 pages. 1226 to 1226, and it's I just read the paper copy. So my first thoughts is that it's set at a German concentration camp, possibly Auschwitz, I couldn't tell. And I wanted to read it for a long time. I think it was originally published in a different language because of how they spell some of the words, like color. And there's only one set of quotation marks when someone speaks. I did notice that. My final impressions, an emotional ending that will stick with me for a while, and it was worth the slow burn. So sad. So yeah, it was kind of a slow burn. Ratings, 3 out of 5 for characters, 4 out of 5 for plot, 3 out of 5 for writing, and overall 4 out of 5. Would I recommend this? I said yes. It's a poignant story of the atrocities of war and cost to human life. It will stick with you. So this takes place World War II, at a concentration camp, and it's about this boy that his dad is an officer, a Nazi officer, and he lives on one side of the wall, the fence. On the other side of the fence is a concentration camp. He befriends a boy that is a prisoner at the concentration camp. They don't know their lots in life, their current lots in life. And so they just become friends. And he thinks of this prisoner as wearing striped pajamas. Of course, those are just the prisoner issued clothes that were given to him. It is a slow burn. I will say it was probably, I think, 70% into this book before, okay, slow to pick up. Slow until 75 to 80% into the book. And then I didn't expect the ending, but it was worth that slow burn. It was so sad. Like I said, it's going to stick with me for a while. It did have some historical figures that made cameos in here. Hitler and his girlfriend Eva. I don't think I can really talk about the rest of this. The main character was a 9-year-old boy. He was totally oblivious to everything around him. And I just felt like this was a story about humanity. And it was really good. So, don't want to give away the ending other than it's not a happy ending. And I would recommend it. It's an easy read. I read it in a day. And I'm glad that my daughter is going to read it. She's reading it very slow. I don't even think she's halfway through yet, but that's her style. Okay, the next book I read is called The All-American by Joe Millen Jr. And I read this for my book club. So I just read the paper copy. This was published in 2023. It's a fairly new book. And I would call this contemporary fiction. It was 309 pages. Just read the paper copy, and it took me 10 days from December 23rd to approximately 10 days to January 3rd. My first thoughts were that it had short chapters and it was easy to read. My final impressions was that it was okay. It was kind of forgettable. It was a teenage boy with really bad luck who comes to terms with it. Ratings out of 5 stars. Characters 2.5, plot 2.5, writing 3, overall 2.75. Would I recommend this, yes or no? I actually said no. I said, unless you like football, contemporary fiction from a 17-year-old boy's view, not my style or very memorable. So basically, a 17-year-old boy is a football player in America for his high school. He was adopted. He's originally came from North Korea with his dad, but he's been raised by his stepmom pretty much his whole life. His dad's out of the picture. Something happens, and he ends up getting deported back to South Korea. And so then he's trying to figure out how to get back to America. And this takes place early 2000s, by the way. So he's trying to figure out how to get back to America and how to learn this world he's in. He doesn't know anything about the South Korean culture, or the language or any of that. And so he has to do some things to be able to get back. And in the end, in the interim, he's kind of coming of age and all of that, and coming to terms with all of these seemingly bad luck things that keep happening to him. So it was interesting. I like that it was a book that I would not normally ever read myself, but I'm not into football. I don't know. He uses words that a 17-year-old boy would use in the early 2000s, and those, whatever. But, yeah, I wouldn't read it again, but I mean, I like going out of my box and reading stuff that I wouldn't normally read. That's part of what makes book club so cool. And our last book in book club was an amazing book, and so I don't mind, just having one that I thought was just okay. Especially because the one I read after it, which I'm going to talk about next, just blew my mind. And that is Kristen Hanna, The Great Alone. You guys, I love this book so much. So much. This is the best book I've read in a really long time. So let me find my notes in here. This is a historical fiction novel. I read it in paper and audio, and it was very well narrated as well as well written. 549 pages, and it took me about a week to read. I read it from January 5th to January 12th. My first thoughts were that it was really good. It's very descriptive writing, likable characters you can relate to, and the Alaska setting brings back a lot of personal memories for me. This takes place in Alaska in the 1970s. I lived in Alaska for a few years, not long, but it really brought me back with the graphic descriptions of Alaska. My last video, I talked about Snow Child, and that actually takes place in Alaska. Just so happened that this one came available in my Libby, so I kind of read two Alaska books shortly together. But this one I would say is even more descriptive and detailed. Very, very good. My final impressions, absolutely beautiful. Beautiful read. It's stunning. I would call this book nearly flawless. I don't know if I could say flawless, because then I don't know. It was dang close to it. This was so good. It's the best book I've read in a long time. Definitely out of the last 61 books I've read, this was my top. There are some triggers in here for domestic violence, grief, mental health, but so good. I would give it 5+ stars. So I give it 5 stars in all of the categories: character, plot, writing, and overall, and I would have given it higher if I could have. Would I recommend this? Obviously, yes. It's beautifully written, touching. It will leave you emotionally wrecked in the best possible way. So this book takes place in the 1970s. This girl, Lenny, her parents are kind of drifters. Her dad he's a Vietnam vet. And when he came back from Vietnam, he had some mental issues. He had some severe PTSD. I think he was a POW over there and didn't really deal with it professionally. And so they move up to Alaska in the 70s, kind of on a whim. And this is about their life there. Follows her through from age 14 into adulthood. So she's 13 when it starts. And it takes place on the Kenai Peninsula, part of Alaska. And let's see, some notes I have on this. I did appreciate whenever a character would say GD, the author would say G-damn. The narrator in the audio said the whole word, but the author didn't, which I thought that was interesting. Like, why even say that? Why not just say damn? But I think the author was trying to prove a point regarding her spirituality. She is a Christian. This isn't a Christian book. The characters are not Christian, but the author is. And so I think some of that came over in that part. And I thought that was interesting because I never have seen that done, and I did appreciate that. But I would give this way more than 5 stars, like I said, if I could. It really brought Alaska to life in a vivid, accurate portrayal. It uses Alaska vocabulary. It's been almost 15 years since I've lived there, and I kind of forgot Alaska has almost its own vocabulary on a lot of things. Snow machines, not snowmobiles. Brown bears, not grizzly bears. The outside, anywhere besides Alaska. Breakup, the first ice breaking up on the river in the spring. Bunny boots, what you wear if you live there. And so it talked about these words and stuff, just like a native Alaskan would. And I thought that was so cool. It does show the beauty and hardship of Alaska and addresses grief, mental health issues, I really want to read more of her books, but I want to read you guys a quote at the end of this. I thought was really descriptive, and this is such a great way to kick off 2025. So it says, "The wild, spectacular beauty of Alaska. It was otherworldly somehow, magical in its vast expanse, an incomprehensible landscape of soaring, glacier-filled white mountains that ran the length of the horizon, knife-tip points pressed high into the cloudless cornflower blue sky." So she uses almost electric language. This language is so alive that she uses to describe Alaska, and I loved it. But the characters too, they were so layered and, I mean, human. They were flawed, they were strong, they were real people. Oh, it was so good. And the author actually, she does have ties to Alaska. She didn't live there, but her family did move up there. I think back in the 70s also. And they still have a fishing lodge there. So, gosh, if I could go back and reread this book for the first time, I would. I just finished it last night, and I'm just having like such a book hangover because I don't know what could top this. Her writing style, oh my goodness, it's amazing. I don't have the vocabulary to express how great this book was. And not just because it was about Alaska, but just her writing style, the way that she writes, bring her characters to life is just amazing. So I do plan on reading more Kristen Hanna novels this year for sure. I want to go back through her backlog. Nightingale is a really popular one. The Women came out last year, and that was Goodreads' #1 historical fiction of 2024. So, yeah, I'm going to be reading some more of her books. But you guys, if you don't read anything else this year, give this book a try. Kristen Hanna, The Great Alone. You will not be disappointed. So, that is all of the books that I've gotten through in the past month or so. Let me know what you've been reading. If you've read any of these books, what your thoughts are on them. 2025 is going to be a good year. I have a goal this year of 60 books. And I also want to go back and reread a book or two from my past. Last year, I read 58 books, and they were all first-time reads for me. I think I want to go back and reread a couple books that I haven't read for a long time, like Dolores Claiborne, because, they say you never read the same book twice. So, thank you guys so much for joining me, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, guys.